Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet another Horus Heresy lore breakdown. We are now on Book 13, Nemesis by James Swallow. Lucky number 13, eh? Especially coming after the Thousand Suns, which is pretty much the biggest title in the entire Horus Heresy series. Indeed, A Thousand Suns even introduced the Horus Heresy to normies, so having to follow that up, well, kind of an impossible task. And Nemesis, yeah, it kind of doesn't. The thing is, Nemesis isn't a bad book. I really love the way they give us more information about how local law enforcement might function outside of the Adeptus Arbites, for example, but at the end of the day, much like the Furious Abyss, Nemesis doesn't tell us a whole lot. It's kind of a pointless book. It has its own self-contained storyline that doesn't really affect much else, except for, I think, one single character, so nevertheless, there are some interesting tidbits of information, so we will be having a look at it. The book primarily focuses on the exploits of the Officio Assassinorum, as they try to put Horus into the ground and thereby ending the rebellion. At least so they think. At this point, I don't really think that would have happened, because Horus might be the figurehead, quote-unquote, but he's not really the leader. Or, well, you know, he is, but I don't think that Mortarion, or Lorgar, or Petarabo, or Fulgrim, or any of them would have stopped fighting if Horus had died. Hell, they barely listened to his instructions half the time anyway, so beyond sending the Sons of Horus into a maddened frenzy, I doubt killing Horus would really have had all that much of an impact on the campaign as a whole. It might have become a little bit more fractious and a little bit less directed, true, but it definitely wouldn't have stopped. Nevertheless, killing Horus sounds like a pretty good idea in and of itself, and all of the major clans of the Officio Assassinorum had had a pop at him over the years. It has, at this point, been 2 years since the horrible atrocities at Istvan. And yeah, that is kind of confusing, coming hot off the heels of the Thousand Suns, but well, continuity's not been a strong point of the Horus Heresy, to put it mildly, so we'll just accept that it's been 2 years. And the first assassin we meet comes from the clad Venom, and he's trying to murder Horus by putting a little alien monstrosity thingity-bob into his wine, something that will apparently, once it enters into the host body, suck every last droplet of moisture out of the host's body, leading to a rather messy death. And that would probably be a pretty good way of killing a Primarch, since, well, even a Primarch needs moisture to live, and considering what a vast majority of the human, even the Primarch's body, is composed of moisture, yeah, that'd probably finish him off alright. Regrettably for our little poisoner, however, he wasn't dealing with just any target. He was dealing with, some unusual things, as Erebus knew exactly what the little poisoner's plan was and was waiting for him outside of Horus's tent as they were preparing to conduct a large-scale ritual sacrifice. Undoubtedly, Erebus has contacts in, what's the phrase? Friends on the other side? And so the poor little poisoner got beaten to death. Or, well, actually, first they broke most of his bones, and then they used his own weapon on him, because the Lunar Wolves have gotten remarkably cuntish since we saw them last, apparently. We also get some rather fascinating information, so apparently this, as we already know, was not the first attempt on Horus's life, and, amusingly enough, Erebus had apparently been intercepting all of them and not telling Horus. Huh. Alright. What possible reason would Erebus have for not telling his boss man that his daddy was trying to sneak murder him? Well, it might have something to do with the rituals, once again. Horus had spent the last 2 years fairly leisurely traveling across the galaxy, completing various rituals and gaining more influence, knowledge, and contacts in the ethereal realm, clearly under the influence of Erebus, and Lorgar to a rather considerable extent. His other brothers had also been wandering about doing their own business. As I mentioned, the early campaign of the traitors was not really a focused affair, with many of them just doing whatever the fuck they wanted. But after the events at Istvan, the Imperium didn't really have the resources or strength necessary to launch a concerted effort against them. This was a very, very risky strategy, and if a couple of things had happened differently, like, for example, Peterabo's very near disastrous engagement with the Imperial Fist reinforcement fleet heading towards Istvan, it could have spelt the end of the heresy right then and there, but that didn't happen. And clearly, Horus was trying to figure out exactly what his friends on the other side were wanting, and how he could use them, as he really didn't trust them, though it is also clear that the Sons of Horus had been slipping further and further down the line of heresy. Though, interestingly enough, they had been keeping these new ideals of them from most of the crew. Now, you need to understand that the way a massive spaceship functions in 40k is that a lot of the spaceship's crew really have absolutely no idea what they're doing. They are sequestered in far below decks. Most of them are involuntary volunteers, shanghaied from various worlds the ships have passed, and they are essentially kept prisoners on the below decks. Vast amounts of the crew, in fact, have very little understanding of what's actually going on, beyond the vague goings and comings of the ship and bombardment duty and stuff like that. A lot of the crew, in other words, wouldn't even be aware of the fact that the heresy had taken place. Hell, even the very gun crews who bombarded Istvan would probably not have the faintest fucking clue who they were actually bombarding. However, during the last 2 years, a lot of rumors had made their way down onto the decks. Rumors of blood sacrifices, of rituals, and dark and grim creatures stalking the halls at night. Well, on the spaceship whenever they turned off the fucking lights to simulate night anyways. These somewhat nasty events are a clear byproduct of increased ritual activity on the ship. Basically, every time somebody does something requiring the warp's influence in an extended format, like a ritual or summoning a demon for, well, advisory services, I suppose you could call it, a little bit of the warp's influence will leak out into the ship as a whole. Now, just using basic psychic activity like the Navigators or Librariuses, this isn't really going to produce much of a psychic leak-through. But something like a blood sacrifice, oh yeah, that is going to quite considerably affect the material realm. Now, one, that'll maybe cause some mild discomfort in the area for years to come. Two, might cause some unfortunate chills to hang in the air, but over the course of 2 years of these things happening all the time, oh, that's going to start warping the very reality itself aboard the ship. This is the reason why chaotic vessels in modern 40k essentially look like giant spaceborne monsters, because so much of the ship has been infused with warp energy that, in part, the ship is more demon than machine. And whilst, of course, radical changes like that will take millennia, 2 years of testing and trying ritualistic sacrifices, and the Sons of Horus ever pushing the bounds, yeah, that's gonna put a dent in the ship, to put it rather mildly. In fact, it is, in all due likelihood, a very unsafe place to work, and bearing in mind, a spaceship is already somewhat lax when it comes to the various security precautions that you might wish for a crew to take around massive machinery. It is then very clear that the Sons of Horus, and definitely the other legions, with one possible exception, they've pretty much all been delving deeper into the mysteries and, well, everything that comes with it. We will also later on in the book hear about various rumors, quote-unquote, of unclean activity taking place on the various planets that the traitor legions are passing, and considering that literally the first words in the book are essentially describing some unclean ritual taking part on our planet, I think we can fairly safely entirely dismiss the rumor part of that particular analysis. There are still some, however, who don't really like this. There are some who express doubt as to whether or not Horus is executing the campaign properly. They would rather see the traitor forces head straight for Terra, and whilst that might make tactical sense, as it undoubtedly would, I think the reality is probably far more complicated. First and foremost, Horus knows that his brothers are unreliable allies at best, and it would be no guarantee that he would be able to actually make them go to Terra without them being able to make sure that their own interests will be properly served beforehand. It's going to be very, very difficult to tear Mortarion away from his new experiments, for example, just because Horus is getting a bit impatient. Additionally, Horus himself also, at this point in time, still is trying to make sure that this crusade of his is for just means. Remember, Horus still thinks that he was wronged by the Emperor. He wishes to make sure that he is not the puppet of the warp that he believes, at least to some extent, that the Emperor has become. He thinks that he is the righteous one here, and well, righteous forces do not fuck around with demons, and as such, Horus wants to make damn sure that he knows enough about this nonsense that he will know for 100% certain that he is in control of anything he chooses to ally himself with. Of course, thinking that he can control the forces of the warp is the precise kind of hubris we saw so much of in 1,000 Suns, but of course, poor Horus doesn't know that. Meanwhile, back home on Terra, the secretive conclave of assassination grandmasters led by Malkador the Sigilite himself were, unsurprisingly, a bit burdened by the news that yet another one of their operatives had been violently beaten to death by traitor Astartes. Especially considering this is, what, their 5th try now? Pretty much every single one of the clans had at least had one pop at Horus at this point, and nothing had really come of it, and they were unsurprisingly getting a little bit demoralized. Since they had all sent off their best and brightest to go play with Horus, and none of them had actually survived. Which is a bit shitty, to be sure. But far more interestingly, we get some information about why the Officio Assassinarum is to begin with. So apparently, it is a shadowy organization within the Imperium that is a technical secret. One of those secrets, no, the Emperor doesn't use assassins. Wink wink. That kind of a secret. Poorly kept, to put it rather mildly, but at least they try to be secretive. It's not like later on in the Imperial history where they will literally have a seat on the goddamn council. They're at least, pretending to not be there. But apparently, they were founded by the Emperor himself on Mount Vengeance, where he supposedly said, "No world shall be beyond my rule, no enemy shall be beyond my wrath." And so far, that had proven true. There had never, in the history of the organization, been an assassination target requiring more than one attempt. Which really does suggest that the Officio Assassinatum are very, very fucking good at their jobs. They've basically never ever failed. Which, I gotta admit, makes it all sound a little bit anticlimactic. It's like, really? You never fucked up once previously? Congratulations, I suppose. And now that they'd all failed once, apparently they were at their wits' ends. Which, I gotta say, this whole thing is fucking amusing to me. So, this organization of assassins is really worried about the ideas of fair play. Like, they're shocked about the idea of sending multiple assassins after Horus. Like, you're already in the business of assassinations, but you feel you have to take turns somehow. Fucking why? They even make a big song and dance about how they've been working on the periphery of the Emperor's knowledge. Like, he knows they're there, and he's, well, kind of tacitly said that, yeah, go ahead and do what you do, but he's kind of also wanted to maintain a semblance of plausible deniability so that he can remain honorable, which I understand, but if it's his job to remain honorable and pure, then surely it's the job of the assassins to be the exact opposite? Isn't that precisely why he created the Officio Assassinorum in the first place, to do what he could not be seen to be doing? And yet here they are, just like, well, we can't send a team of assassins after him, that just wouldn't be sporting. I guess this whole, always succeeding in one try has kind of made them dumb, I guess. But luckily, this day they are joined with somebody with an actual resemblance of common fucking sense. If one assassin can't kill Horus, try just throwing all of them at him. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? Failure? I mean, that's no worse than what's been happening before, so might as bloody well. Though a compromise is reached. One assassin from each clade will be sent to try and murder Horus. Again, I'm kind of like, why don't you just throw everything at him? Do you have more important targets anywhere than the fucking War Master? I don't know. I mean, I went on at length about the fact that I don't think this would stop the traitorous Nazis by any stretch of the imagination, but it'd certainly piss him off. And as we've all known, considering the whole Istvan thing, an angry enemy is one that's rather easy to lure into a trap. Anyways, all of them agree that they're going to be sending one assassin from each clan in a kill team, something that has never been done before, and they're just horrified by the idea. I mean, why would we assassins play unfair? That's just silly. I mean, shooting somebody with a specialized hyper-duper-looper-ooper super-duper sniper rifle from 16 kilometers away, you know, that's okay, but heaven forbid we send more than one dude at a time. These guys have some twisted sense of morality. Anyways, it turns out that the mystery individual that suggested the kill team was Constantine Valdor, of all people, which pretty much all of the assassins had already guessed because, well, he's fucking huge, and he's hiding himself in a goddamn cloth robe. Valdor, you're like 2.5 meters tall. You're gonna need more than a layer of clothing to go like, ha ha ha, I am just a normal man. Trying to hide Constantine Valdor with a cape is like trying to hide an elephant with a napkin, but hey, details. And it would appear that somebody else agrees with me. This little conclave of assassins had gone more or less undetected in the most secure location of the Imperial Palace for God only knows how many hundreds of years. But then Constantine Valdor drags his oversized gleaming gold arse into one meeting, and immediately the day after, Dorn is standing right there in the Custodes training hall, looking at Valdor with a suspicious look and going, "So Valdor, something you'd like to tell me?" Now, it could be purely coincidental that the very first goddamn meeting Valdor attends, Dorn immediately snaps up on, but I'd be surprised. Now, Valdor tries to put on his very, very best no daddy, I never touched the cookie jar face, but Dorn is not convinced. In fact, Dorn is the exact opposite of convinced. Dorn is annoyed and pissed, which is the exact things you really don't want Dorn to be. You see, whatever Dorn lacks in subtlety, he makes up for with sheer bullheaded brutality. He's the kind of superhuman that solves a puzzle by pulverizing it with a hammer and then reassembling the pieces. Something Constantine Valdor should have been painfully aware about, considering relatively recent events in a previous short story, where his Custodes ran into a little bit of a ploy orchestrated by Dorn, and Dorn's reaction to having his ploy revealed was to dump his happy little ass in a squadron of fucking Terminators down on the Custodes in question. Luckily, that whole event ended without Imperial servants shooting at one another, but it strikes me as remarkably bold of Constantine Valdor to look Dorn in the face and go, "No, massa, I have no clue about these shadowy assassins you were talking about." By the way, my personal favorite assassination group has got to be the Infocyte Crazies. I really love their idea of like the perfect assassination is one carried out in an entirely different solar system. Because it's awesome. I mean, these people can hack into somebody's pleasure bot and make it strangle the target to death and make it all look like some kind of freak malfunction. They're the kind of guys who assassinate people by having a chandelier just randomly drop on them. Nobody even knows it was an assassination at that point. I fucking love them. They are awesome, and I'm really glad we're going to be seeing some more of them because I adore that kind of fully-on hardcore keikakudori nonsense anime plotlines. I'm sorry, I just love that kind of shit. It's really appealing to me. That's why I fucking love heist movies, but I am wandering somewhat off the point. Let's see if we can't shimmy this back on to the whole assassination thingy, shall we? So, first and foremost, is it really a usual thing for the Imperium to try and murder its own servants? Well, you know, not really servants in this case, but do these guys have any real clue about how to assassinate an Astartes? Well, yes, probably. In fact, they have done so before. The various clads have terminated Astartes previously. Now, they seem to be relatively singular events, so in all due likelihood, this wasn't anything to do with the two missing legions. Why they would have done it? Well, that's pure speculation, but we do know that the assassination clads have knocked off a couple of at least captains within the Astartes legions previously. And of course, they drop planetary governors and imperial army officials like fucking flies because, well, they're just humans, and they have a nasty habit of getting a bit, shall we say, creative with the Imperium's finances. Nevertheless, it's pretty interesting to know that they have actually killed the Astartes previously, and they must have done so damn quietly as well because, well, the Astartes tend to not take that kind of stuff lying down. Now, let's wander off into the galaxy a bit, because we do get a couple of rather interesting little tidbits of information about how Horus's campaign is progressing. We hear various rumors about all kinds of horrible shit happening on the planets that the War Masters is taking over. Now, we've already kind of gotten impressions of this, but it's really interesting to know that this is happening on such a wide scale. It isn't just Horus or some of his more, dastardly brothers. This appears to be happening in organized fashion throughout the entirety of the Traitor Legion's campaigns. Now, this is interesting due to two reasons. One, it means that all of them, absolutely all of them, have to some extent started corrupting themselves and experimenting with the warp, and secondly, it means that these noble ideas that the rebels started with, or, well, relatively speaking, noble ideas, didn't fucking last long, did they? Now, part of this could be a deliberate strategy on the part of Horus. Horus understands that the only good war is a short war, and the only short war is a terrible war. He might simply be using fear as a weapon, or at the very least, he is using the side effect of fear as a weapon. Basically, he thinks that if I do something really, really terrible to this one planet, then the next 3 planets will just kind of go like, okay, fair enough. We're gonna surrender. And hey, he does have the goddamn Night Lords on his side, so, you know, might as well make use of their special talents. Oh, you know, again, one thing that does confuse me a little bit. Horus started this whole thing with the best of intentions. He really did think that the Emperor had betrayed him, and again, you know, the only good war, short war, etc., but he really does seem to be pushing this whole fear tactic really, really far. Again, the Horus that we used to know was compassionate. He was the one who said that the only way to build a lasting Imperium was to leave the worlds they conquered better off after being conquered. Clearly, it isn't just a political thing. He hasn't just been talked into this. He must have been in some way corrupted directly by chaos. Otherwise, this wouldn't really make any sense. I mean, if his foundational belief is that he couldn't possibly rule the galaxy if he conquered it with fear, then he probably wouldn't be cultivating it quite as fiercely as he currently is. Now, you might say that perhaps he thinks that, oh, I have to do this because this is a really, really difficult military campaign. I have to use every arrow in my quiver, but I don't know. It doesn't seem like what Horus would do from what we know of Horus. Again, I feel like the transformation from Horus to Horus the War Master is still kinda just sudden, you know? I wish this had been, you know, done a little bit more slowly and given a bit more time to grow organically. It really annoys me how Horus kinda went from good guy to absolutely unadulterated, pure fucking evil, just kind of overnight. I really wish we would have a couple books in between, you know, the 2-year gap, to kind of explain to us why Horus was going this hard in on the Night Lord's strategies. Though, bear in mind, it is also possible that this isn't really an intentional strategy. It is simply a byproduct of Horus trying to gain the understanding and knowledge required to properly deal with the creatures of the warp, which, well, as we know, gaining that knowledge is not particularly clean, shall we say. It certainly would inspire a few tales of horrors, to put it very bloody mildly. Oh, and speaking of terrors, we're just about at 25 minutes. Time sure does fly, doesn't it? Now, moving a little bit away from the whole assassination thing, we get a very interesting little piece of information. So, whilst all of this has been going on, we've had a little bit of a crime novel sneaking into our 40k, chasing down a serial killer. I'm not going to go too much into that because, frankly, it's not really that interesting from a 40k lore breakdown standpoint. It's a cool story, but, there's not a whole lot of cool 40k related information that is really applicable to the wider universe, which is, again, one of the reasons why Nemesis kind of feels like a slightly pointless book, but hey, details. We do get one very interesting little thing, though. So, this part of space is almost partially run by a particularly wealthy rogue trader, a baron of sorts, and he must have a fuck ton of money indeed, because he has been able to acquire a special writ allowing him to employ a trained psyker. And this, of course, is years after the Edict of Nicaea, and yet here we are, with a Void Baron being able to employ a psyker. Huh. The Emperor banned his favoured sons, the Legiones Astartes, from using psykers, and yet a rogue trader is allowed to? And bear in mind, he has an actual writ from the Imperium. He isn't just, sneaking this thing around. He paid for it. In fact, he paid an entire goddamn moon to be allowed to use this lady. Which, wow. Is that all it costs? I'm thinking a couple of Astartes legions would have loved to pay that tax. Like, what, really? If we pay you a planet, we can keep our librarius? Sounds like a fucking fantastic deal to us. I'm kind of joking, of course. Obviously, there's a difference between allowing a single rogue trader to sanction a single psyker and allowing a legion to keep their librarius, but nevertheless, the Emperor was pretty goddamn clear in his condemnation of psykers. It really does amaze me that this was apparently sanctioned. Again, of course, there's a limit to how much damage one psyker, even if completely uncontrolled, could possibly do, but it kind of goes right against the word of the Emperor. Then again, it's entirely possible that the Emperor simply doesn't fucking know, Just the fact that he has an imperial writ doesn't mean that the Emperor knows about it. There might be one of those functionaries that got a little bit creative around the Imperium's finances again. Entirely possible. Nevertheless, it certainly is a rather interesting little thing. Now, with that brief as it may have been interlude, let's get back to the assassination nonsense. So, one kind of ridiculous thing, the assassination group that is being organized by the Imperium will have a Vindicari and a Venom. Obviously enough, since one of each. But for some reason, they chose to send a Vindicari and a Venom, who also happen to be brother and sister. Estranged brother and sister, who had basically promised to never see each other again, or at least the sister had, because Oni-chan had been a bad boy. It strikes me as somewhat counterproductive to a good assassination mission to throw in some personal shit like that, but oh well, it's not like their assassination target is a difficult one. It's only fucking Horus. What problems could a bit of family drama possibly cause? Whilst the servants of the Imperium are busy bungling the assassination attempt before it's even goddamn begun by introducing unnecessary elements of drama, the ruinous powers are taking a rather different approach. Turns out that it isn't just the Imperium that are doing the unhonorable thing of sending assassins. The bad guys are too, or more specifically, Erebus. Erebus has found himself a very, very interesting little toy, courtesy, at least partially, of the Officio Assassinorum. Now, a part of the Officio used the so-called blank psykers to create Calexis assassins. These guys essentially focus the power of a Psyker through their own null soul, and then forces that psychic energy into a specially created weapon piece that essentially allows the Psyker to be destroyed by his own psychic powers. Additionally, by absorbing the Psyker's powers, it protects the Collector's assassin. This obviously means that the Collectors are a very, very specific weapon to be used against enemy Psykers. And since, of course, Horus and his legions did not obey the Edict of Nicaea, unfucking surprisingly, bringing a Collectors along might have its uses. However, they'd also been experimenting with something else. One extraordinarily rare type of mutant, also known as a Deus Ex Machina, to be entirely honest. Anyways, they'd apparently found a psychic null that wasn't just a psychic null. Because whilst a psychic null might be turned into a Collector's assassin with a lot of training and a lot of specialized gear, this little Psyker could do the things that the Collectors did, taking a target's psychic powers and turning them upon the target naturally. All he needed was to taste a drop of their blood. Already this shit is sounding just a wee bit heretical, and the Officio would agree. The entire project was terminated, deemed a wee bit too risky, and everything related to it, data, instruments, personnel, and, of course, the mutant itself, was put aboard a ship and sent towards the heart of a star. Unfortunately, for some mystical reason, they decided to send the ship against the star in the middle of heretical Astartes' controlled territory. Seems like a pretty fucking stupid decision to me, but hey, details. And so this lovely little mutant fell into the arms of Erebus, along with any and all information about the project. Now, Erebus, of course, not content to just take a natural mutation, decided to improve upon the creature just a little bit by strengthening his powers. He did this the same way that they usually do, by making a demon om-nom-nom on his soul and sew itself nice and tight to his skin. Essentially, he had a demon of the warp rip its way out of the immaterium, tear off the poor little motherfucker's skin, and instead become his skin. Yes, that is exactly as painful as it sounds. Now, there are quite a few problems with this, however, which is why I call it a Deus Ex Machina, because the guy's a psychic null. He's a pariah. Demons can't even exist near him, because he doesn't just, cancel out or hide or disrupt the vagaries of the warp. He eats it up and basically deletes it. And a demon literally lives off that warp energy. So a demon could never bond itself to a psychic null, because they wouldn't have anything to feed off. They would be cut off from anything that they would require to actually live. It would be like putting a human in fucking vacuum. The most important part that he needs to live just wouldn't be there, and yet here the demon is, living on this dude's skin and not, by the way, possessing him. This isn't like Lorgar's little experiments where they put a demonic soul inside of Astartes and the two can chitter-chatter away and have dating tips and shit. No. The demon's skin is 100% subjugated to the will of the host. Something else which I've pretty much never heard of, a demon subjugated to its hosts. Huh. Granted, Erebus did say that it was a very, very minor demonic entity, but if it is a smaller demonic entity, then that should just mean that it would have even less of a chance of surviving near a psychic null. This really doesn't make any sense whatsoever, so we'll just skip over that as good old-fashioned writer's prerogative, essentially. Anyways, Spear has a rather interesting power. He does not need to tap into a target's aura to use it against the target, or to absorb a burst of psychic energy to then channel it through the Collector's weapon and fire it back at the target. All he needs is a drop of the target's blood. This is why Erebus came up with a rather brilliant plan. He would send Spear out to find himself a mark of trade. This is a symbol of a rogue trader's authority, and in the early days, these would be signed with a droplet of the Emperor's own blood. You can start seeing the pieces fall into place here, can't you? If all Spear needs to attack a target is to have tasted their blood, and he can turn their own psychic powers upon them, ergo, the stronger the target's psychic powers, the stronger the attack, then if he could get a hold of a droplet of the Emperor's blood, he would be able to turn the powers of one of the most powerful psychic beings in the galaxy upon that very same being. That might just be enough to kill said being. Now, granted, neither Erebus nor Spear were entirely sure about how this was going to work, if it was going to work, or if it was going to work, how close they would have to get to the Emperor for it to work, etc. But, hey, it was worth a try, wasn't it? Worst case scenario, Erebus had lost another puppy, which he really didn't give a shit about. Spear was, at most, a minor experiment to him. He'd put some effort into it, but you know, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. On the other hand, if, by some chance, Spear was successful, oh me oh my, that would guarantee Erebus all the plaudits he would ever have wanted from the Chaos Gods. Demon Prince status, undoubtedly, and probably even more rewards. It was undoubtedly worth a bit of a roll of the dice. Unfortunately for Erebus, his cunning little plan would be rather messed up by the little assassination team. The assassination team had been sent to a specific planet because they'd heard that Horus would show up to wave his little flag around and proclaim himself boss man and all of that nonsense. And it was then assumed that the assassination team would have a good chance of blowing his little head off his shoulders. And they did a pretty good job of it. They tried, damnedest that they could, to get into a position. In fact, it even seemed like they might succeed. Although, I gotta ask why the hell they would have thought that. Okay, so they know that a delegation from the War Master's ship is coming down to the planet. They see a person step off this ship wearing the War Master's mantle. Now, that would clearly suggest that the guy wearing the mantle is the War Master. And so, when he starts taking off his helmet, they have a pop at him, using a special combination. First, the Vindicare fires a special shield-breaking round, because obviously a target of this import would have some pretty damn hefty defenses, and, correctly, they did. There was a miniature void shield generator. Now, this is nothing like the ones on Titans, mind you, but it's more than enough to dissipate the energy of an incoming projectile. However, this round was designed specifically to take down this kind of a shield for a fraction of a second, linked to fire at the precise moment that this projectile takes down the void shield. A high-energy portable las cannon set up in another building would fire at the exact same spot that the projectile had just impacted upon the void shields. Meaning that the poor little bastard who was about to take off his helmet ate a las cannon blast directly to the face, taking anything that might at one point have resembled a head off the target and turning it into nice little dusty particles. Problem was, it wasn't Horus. It was Luke Sadir, who had been sent down in his stead wearing his mantle. And by the way, this was no accident. Horus had specifically given him that mantle and sent him down to the surface. Horus clearly knew what was up. Erebus, however, didn't. In fact, Erebus had no clue that there was a Officio Assassinorum group on the planet. It would appear that Erebus' stock amongst the demonic entities is falling rather rapidly, as they are clearly whispering secrets to Horus that they are not whispering to him. And Horus makes a point out of this. He tells Erebus that he is not to employ any means like spear or assassins again. Clearly, Horus still has some nobility in him, or, well, rather than nobility, he probably understands that assassinating the Emperor wouldn't end the war. It would just send his loyalists into a frenzy. And if anything, Horus might find himself on the receiving end of a careless do-or-die blitzkrieg, the very kind he originally planned, against Terra. And whilst Horus is clearly quite capable of surviving any assassination attempt, a full-blown counterattack by every single loyalist that is left, that might be somewhat more dangerous. Additionally, Horus clearly is painfully aware of the sedition within his own ranks. As I mentioned, he sent Luke Sedar down there to die. He knew he was going to get his face blown off, or at the very least he knew there was a pretty goddamn good chance that he'd be getting his face blown off. Now, how precisely the Officio Assassinatum operatives didn't recognize that this was a regular Astartes instead of a Primarch, fucked if I know. I mean, yes, he was wearing the correct mantle, but Primarch is way bigger. Couldn't he just look through the scope of his little sniper rifle and go like, he's way too fucking short. That isn't Horus. And instead, he kind of just went like, yeah, no, that's probably him. Pew-pew. Maybe he didn't bother to double check, I don't know. But on the bright side, they managed to kill Spear using experimental technology, by the way, a psi grenade, which is something else the Imperium would probably have had good use of. Wow, they're coming up with a lot of weapons that have been really useful here, wouldn't they? So an anti-psychic grenade that is capable of making the demon skin attached to Spear writhe in agony as it basically dies. That sounds like a rather useful weapon. Sounds like something that should have been mass-produced a bit, but, well, secretive Officio Assassinorum tech? Yeah, the Officio is known for not wanting to share its toys too wildly, so I can't exactly complain too much about that. Now, we also get another very interesting little tidbit of information. Apparently, the first rogue traders that have been scattering throughout the galaxy under the Emperor's own aegis, mind you, were spreading the idea of his divinity. Apparently, they were even carrying around the Lectitio Divinitatis. That doesn't match up with the timeline at fucking all. I'm really wondering if we can take that for canon, because apparently the book is suggesting that even from the earliest days, the Void Baron and his family of rogue traders had been spreading the word of the Emperor's divinity. Now, that does not mean that the Emperor himself ordered it, but I'm kind of surprised if he wouldn't have known about it, considering how long this had been going on. Now, granted, they did do so in relative secrecy. It's not like the rogue traders were openly, bombastically declaring the fact that they were followers of the Emperor as a divine being. Instead, they were seeding various secluded and secretive groups on the various planets they visited, who knew themselves as the Theog. And they also had access to the Lectitio. This has all kinds of interesting implications, particularly, this happened before Logar wrote his book. Now, it is possible that they essentially implemented it later on, that, you know, the cults came first, but it doesn't sound like it from the way it's written. I'm wondering if this is yet another one of those kind of I didn't read the storyline entirely before writing the book kind of things, or if this is suggesting that the Emperor might have planned this from the very beginning, which seems odd. The Emperor knows that creating a new deity in the warp wouldn't really solve anything, even if it was himself technically in deity form. The warp always goes to the most extreme, which means that even if the Emperor existed as a god, it would be the most extreme version of the Emperor, because this is simply how the warp functions. It constantly wishes for more extreme emotions to feed itself better, and the Emperor undoubtedly knew this. There's a lot of implications here that are kinda on shaky ground, so I don't want to speculate too much. But we are almost at the end, so let's move on, shall we? It's kind of nice to get a book every now and then which I can bang through in one video rather than the monster that was the Thousand Suns. Anyways, back home on Terra, the Officio had to realize that their ploy of just throwing a bunch of assassins at Horus hadn't worked. So then, what next? Well, before they could really come to contemplate that, they were interrupted by Dorn, kicking down their door and flooding their oh-so-secretive chamber with Imperial fists. Like I said, Dorn's the kind of person who solves the problem in the most practical, if blunt, fashion possible. He wanted to put an end to this shadowy organization because he figured it might sow some discord within the loyalist ranks, and yeah, he wasn't incorrect in assuming that. What he was incorrect in assuming, however, as were the Officio by the way, was who was listening. Turns out that the Officio Assassinorum was not functioning at quite the periphery of the Emperor's knowledge that they had originally thought, as he was a member of their very meetings. He simply stepped out from a bunch of shadows and introduced himself. How the Emperor remained hidden in a room like that is, well, rather obvious really. He's the fucking Emperor. He does whatever he wants to do. And honestly, did anybody ever think that they could hide something like this from him? Hell, he was the one who originally sanctioned this shit. The fact that the Officio even thought for a second that he wouldn't understand fully what they were doing is kind of mind-blowing, really. Now, the Emperor understood Dorn's point. This might be a point of contention, and so he decided to remove the Officio Assassinorum in its shadowy role and instead implement them as a fully open and official part of the Imperium. He was going to bring the assassins out into the light. He could no longer hide or shield himself from what had to be done, and so, to avoid any further split within his loyalists, which were quite obvious here with Constantine Valdor on one side, the Officio on another, and then Dorn and a bunch of Imperial fists on the third side, it was best, then, if everybody could simply get the insight they so clearly wanted into the workings of the Officio, and hopefully then everybody would be able to play like good little children, and not fuck too much with each other's toys. Whether or not this is all going to be turning out to be all that good of an idea, well, we'll see. I'm thinking that Dorn is still a little bit hesitant, although, you know, this was a direct order from Daddy, so obviously he's going to comply with it, but he's not entirely fond of this whole shadowy assassination nonsense, and he undoubtedly would have much preferred if there was none at all of it going around. On the other hand, I'm sure that at a certain level he understands the value of the Officio Assassinorum, especially these days where his brother is making so effective use of fear. If the Empire cannot employ their own little fearmongers to keep potential planetary governors in check, well, that might create all kinds of problems. Problems that his Imperial fists might have to bleed to fix. At the end of the day, it's a hell of a lot cheaper to take care of a rebellious planetary governor with a single bullet fired from 12-odd kilometers than an entire chapter of Imperial fists. Now then, that has been Nemesis. Next up in line is the First Heretic, and oh boy, I'm looking forward to that one. If Nemesis didn't have too much in the way of really interesting information, the First Heretic is going to be making up for all of that because it is chock full of cool little things, and it really does a fantastic job at giving us a nice, cool, long look into the psychology of Lorgar. And he really is a pretty tragic anti-hero, even if Blame Lorgar is still fully applicable. He might have his reasons for going full batshit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're particularly good reasons. Until then, I have been Arch, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.